Hey there, everybody. Welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution. My name is Lailani, and this is my show. This is how we grow. I am over the moon excited because I am welcoming back one of my favorite people in the whole wide world who just came out with another awesome banger of a book. And we're going to talk about it today. But before we talk about it today, and before I bring him on, I kind of wanted to let you know that I know I've been sort of on an Espiritismo kind of rant lately. I've had a lot of people come on about different kind of subjects in Espiritismo. I've talked about Espiritismo regarding the ATRs. We've talked about the different kinds of spirits and hierarchy in Espiritismo. We've talked about the future of Espiritismo and where it might be heading. But today I want to bring Hector Salva on, the author of Espiritismo, Puerto Rican Mediumship and Magic, because I want to focus on a subject that's close to home, which is La Isla de Puerto Rico, right? And the spiritual practices that are there. Now, for those of you who do not know who Hector Salva is, y'all need to get with it, okay? Because this person is amazing. He is known as Houngan Hector. He is a Brujo Espiritista of the 21 divisions and Sanse Espiritismo. He is the author of the 21 divisions, Mysteries and Magic of Dominican Voodoo, and Dona Juana, Journey of a Brujo, Espiritista, and Healer. And then, of course, Espiritismo, Puerto Rican Mediumship and Magic. Since 1989, he has helped tens of thousands of people worldwide. He is the founder and leader of an international spiritual institute with members and apprentices all over the world. So let's do it. Let's talk about it. Let's bring him on.
Hi, Lailani. How are you? It's awesome to be
Hey.
here with you today.
Oh my gosh, I am so happy. Can I am I allowed to ask, am I the first interview that you've done regarding like since your book came out or like at least close to the first? Like
Yeah, close. I think this is my third or fourth. So yeah.
I'm in the top 10. I'm in the top 10. Okay. So you are one of my favorite people ever. I'm so glad you decided to come back and talk about this book. I read this book like twice. I couldn't stop reading it. And I teach spiritism from like an academic point of view, and I'm telling you right off the bat, this is going to be a required reading as part of the curriculum from here on out. This is a banger. Listen, if you guys don't already have this book, I'm gonna put the link to it in the chat right now. Go get the book so that you are not left behind. So, Papa Hector, let's get into this. There is so much meat and juiciness into it, but I don't want to give everything away. What I do want to kind of focus on, though, is just like a little bit of the history, because you talk a lot in the very beginning about sort of this war on Espiritismo and how like it was disappearing and fading away. I wanted to find out from you, like, what was the purpose of that? Like, why did that situation happen?
So a lot of it had to do simply with there was a very much a war on Espiritismo when the U.S. gained ownership over Puerto Rico. That happened. I can't remember the year right off the bat. Before 1918 or around there. Shortly after that, the Americans, and naturally many American background is a Protestant nature, right? Both the Americans and the American Protestants went to really a battle against Espiritismo because they saw it as something that kept the island and its people as backwards, savage, behind the times, uneducated. But prior to even the Americans getting there, the Kardashian spiritists had already been waging a war on Espiritismo in order to kind of differentiate their version of Espiritismo and also to claim that, like, basically our version of Espiritismo was something of a lower class, a lower nature, unevolved, etc.
So
So,
speaking of the Kardecian Espiritismo, let's kind of, like you said, let's kind of rewind a little bit. You said that there are different types of Espiritismo, and
yeah,
especially in the islands, and we see those different types of Espiritismo happening with the influx of the African influences and with the influx of the European influences. Can you explain those differences and then kind of lead our way into like how it became, how our particular one started to fade?
okay. So basically, prior to the influence of Allan Kardec, where we got the name Espiritismo, on the island, there were already spiritual practices because the islands, unknown to many, the Taino Indians never disappeared. They just assimilated. They got bred, let's say, into being mixed with Spanish as well as mixed with some African. So there were already native healing practices and spiritual practices of the Taino, the African, and even some European practices that had already been there and been being worked. Eventually came the Allan Kardec's version of Spiritism, or what's known as Espiritismo in Spanish. And that came to the island via the children of wealthy people on the island who were sending their children to France where there were universities. Still in the island of Puerto Rico, you didn't have the infrastructure to have what was considered high quality schools and universities and libraries and all these other things. So they sent them back to France and to Spain to go ahead and study. During that time, they ran into Allan Kardec and Allan Kardec's teachings, which had started to gain popularity over there. Now, something that people don't understand about Allan Kardec often is that Allan Kardec was not a medium. Allan Kardec was a researcher.
Right.
He is given credit for codifying Espiritismo, right, or Spiritism, but in reality, all that he was the compiler of information. He was a researcher. Okay, something else people don't know about Allan Kardec is that Allan Kardec did a lot of those mediums that contributed to his research dirty. So, so that's another thing that he took. Not only did he take the majority of the credit, but he also kept the majority of the money to himself from all his sales of these books, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something else people don't know about Allan Kardec. So Allan Kardec's Spiritism was codified there in France. And not only did Allan Kardec, he saw his version of Spiritism as being like the next form of science, the next advanced science, right? And he also saw it as being important in bringing social change, social justice, and the change of the control of the Catholic Church over France. And so this fell in line with the social change that many of the criollos, which were mixed blood Puerto Ricans, those children of those wealthy people were looking for, because they were neither Hispanic, totally Spaniard anymore, or they were never, or not totally African or Native, right? And so in politics and in society, in many ways in Puerto Rico, they were being held down. So it very much appealed to them, and they brought it back. Being how Puerto Rican be, right? We're very much adaptable, right?
Yes.
And we saw that this was being very much accepted, and many of the concepts fit in alignment with our concepts. And so basically we took that on as well, and in many ways we took on some of that. What people don't realize, though, with Puerto Rican Espiritismo versus Allan Kardec's Espiritismo is that they're actually more different than they are alike. Allan Kardec's version of Espiritismo, even Spiritism, even has a somewhat current of racism in it.
Oh my God, does it?
Very few people realize about it, right? And naturally, if we're mixed blood, that's just not going to work for us.
Right.
But his whole idea was like, one of his ideas was that basically people born of African or non-Caucasian bloodlines were basically not as evolved.
Right.
And they were born into that position because that represents where they're at spiritually in their work to become more evolved, right?
Right.
Also, there was a whole line of thought as far as like eating in a certain form, mainly vegetarianism, a form of vegetarianism, right? Which is easy to do when you have wealth, but not always easy to do on an island. And where wealth may not, you eat what you can get.
Right.
So there's that. There's also a lot against like practices that were native to us, which were like the use of altars, the dealing with deities, the dealing with saints and spirits, the dealing with magic, with manifestation, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
So we took those parts which fit in alignment in many ways with us. Well, part of that was we didn't really have a name for what we did. So Espiritismo really worked as a name. So eventually what happened is those who were Kardashian Espiritista wanted to segregate themselves from those that they saw who were also being called Espiritista, but that they saw as lower class or lesser than them, or holding backwards, unevolved, uneducated beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so they started a war against Espiritistas who practiced Puerto Rican Espiritismo. And they started a huge scale battle campaign. There were ads, there were newspaper ads, there were little pamphlets that they would pass out, etc. Eventually, when the US came to own the island and they also wanted to make change, they saw that they could kind of exploit the Kardashians' drive, right? Give them the money. And in many ways, the Kardashians would help to do the majority of the work, right? To get rid of them and basically push down and slowly eradicate our traditions, right?
Mm.
Nevertheless, we survived as we are because we're survivors.
Of
So
course.
we survived and we were able to continue on. However, over time, because now we're Americans, okay, over time, many of our culture and our traditions did get eroded, and many people who were practicing what we did got eroded. There was a time in Puerto Rico in the early 1900s where they sold more books on Espiritismo than the whole world had sold religious books in 1 year.
Wow.
Okay. And there was a saying at one time that my grandparents would say, it was that there's a saying that they say about Haiti. That saying is that Haiti's 95% Catholic, 100% Voodoo. Right? And there was apparently a very much the same saying about Puerto Rico. They used to say that Puerto Rico was 90% Catholic, 10% Protestant, 100% Espiritista. Through us being able to go back and forth to America, through the campaign of Americanization, plus through many other cultures that came into the island and brought their own forms of Espiritismo, while at the same time ours is being persecuted. Slowly, all of this withered and withered and withered the practice, so that nowadays there's very few Espiritista who actually practice what we call, Puerto Rican Mesa Blanca Espiritismo.
Definitely. Like, and speaking of the other cultures as well, too, like I know in my family, for example, we have a lot of Asian that had come in through Puerto Rico. Like I have Japanese in my blood. And like I remember my mother telling me like when our family finally got to New York during World War II, my grandmother was actually taken away to go to one of the Japanese concentration camps here in America. And it wasn't until she opened up her mouth and was speaking Spanish that they realized that she's not fully, Japanese.
Yeah.
And so this and meanwhile in Puerto Rico you have the traditions of like Shintoism, like a lot of their ancestral traditions coming in and kind of spreading. So when you were saying how Puerto Ricans, how we are just in general, people in the Caribbean in general, adapting, and how we just kind of like absorb and alter and kind of move things around so that everything kind of flows in the right direction. We did that, and there was still a little bit of some differences though. Like, for example, you mentioned in your book that there's a difference in Espiritismo with regards to Cuban Espiritismo versus Puerto Rican Espiritismo. Can you explain a little bit about those differences?
So there's many differences, but firstly, I would say that Cuban Espiritismo has different influences, right?
Okay.
So their culture has different influences, such as the influences of a practice known as Lucumi, which many people call Cuban Santeria, and as well as Palo Mayombe. In some ways and forms, these practices have influenced their version of Espiritismo, and some things have bled over into each other, right?
Mm.
And they have bled over from those other religious practices. That's one. Another difference is actually how we do the rituals. So
Right.
the rituals are actually quite different to each other, right? How the setup is of the room, how we approach the spirits. Basically, our form of working is different than the others. For example, like in Puerto Rican Espiritismo, the way that we work with our spirits is known as a mesa espiritual. That's a spiritual table. That's the English, right? So a spiritual table, and on this spiritual table, all of your spirits go there, right? And there's a central glass of water, and all your spirits go there. Whereas over in Cuban Espiritismo, they mainly use what's called the bóveda. And a bóveda is a table that's made for the ancestors, for the spirit guides. They often use many, many different glasses dedicated to different groups of spirits or to different individual spirits, right? And they have certain spirits or saints or things that they won't put on this table,
Mm.
right? Or certain rules around it in a certain way that we have different rules around those things. When we deal with um, what we call causa spirits or negative entities and negative spirits. One of the things about Puerto Rican Espiritista in the Mesa Blanca, what we do is we work to educate the spirit, bring the spirit and the person healing so that both can progress and move on. Most
Mm.
commonly, and that goes through a process known as trabajando la causa or working the cause. Whereas mostly what I've seen in Cuban Espiritismo is that they work on removing the spirit and sending the spirit away. Whereas that education healing process is not so much emphasized. Now there are places quite naturally where there are kind of hybrids of these things because
Mhm.
Cubans came into Puerto Rico and they brought their practices with them. And so there are hybrids that exist where there's like a little bit of this influence and a little bit of that influence. But there's many differences between the two types of Espiritismo, Cuban versus Puerto Rican Espiritismo, and each one has actually influenced the other. So they have influenced each other, just as there's a different type of Espiritismo in Venezuela, right?
Right.
There's another type of Espiritismo in Venezuela,
In
but
Brazil, all
Brazil,
over.
all over, especially in like South America, the Caribbean, there's various forms of Espiritismo. A lot of them have their differences and their different spirits that they work with, depending on the cultures that they're in, right? The other spiritual religious influences that were in that culture as well. Like nothing exists even though we live on the island, these spiritual realms don't necessarily exist on separate little lands, right? They can tend to kind of influence and mix and meld and things of that nature.
So, what is then the role of the Espiritista in Puerto Rican Espiritismo, in Mesa Blanca? Because And specifically, like, just to use this as an example, do Puerto Rican Espiritistas mount spirits in the same way that a lot of the Cuban Espiritismos work with their spirits?
Yes. So Puerto Rican Espiritista mount spirits, right? The role of the Espiritista is there's a few things. So the role of Espiritista is healer, a person to help bring light and to bring progress, right? To bring healing, both to the individual, but also to any other spirits that may be around, that may be causes of negativity or need healing in order to progress. And as an espiritista, we see many of problems or issues that you may not think are related to healing as being healing based. So, love and relationship problems. Many of these problems are healing based, right? And financial issues, healing based. Some espiritistas are also brujos, right, which are witches or magicians, which it's a different approach at attaining a result, right? They're using magical work. But primarily, an espiritista is a healer. He's someone who's bringing about evolution. And as I differentiated in my book, someone can be an espiritista and not a medium. And someone can, right, just as someone can be a medium and not an espiritista. We find mediums in spiritualism. Spiritualism is an American spiritual practice, right? Or it's also in Europe, right? But those spiritual practices do not have any of these other tones that we have in Espiritismo, such as reincarnation and the evolution of the spirit. That's a practice of spiritualism, is primarily speaking with the dead, right? So, but they have mediums. So someone can be a medium and not be an espiritista, and someone can be an espiritista and not a medium. Just like someone can be a Christian and not a pastor. And someone can be a pastor, but not necessarily a Christian pastor. Right? So the role of an espiritista is to be a person. If we're talking about an espiritista, whether he or she is a medium or not, they're a person that's dedicated themselves to God and to evolution and to progress and to progress their spirit, right? Because one of the greatest healings that you can give to the world is to not be a weight in the world, to not be a source of problems, right? To actually be someone who brings happiness and joy and whose life is a prayer, right? So, like I always teach people, you cannot pray any higher than the way you live. Okay? You cannot pray higher than how you live. And what I mean by that, is clear. You can't sit there and pray, and then live in a different way. The highest prayer that you can give is the way that you live. There's no higher prayer. You're dedicating your life. So this is a very much a Puerto Rican espiritista teaching concept, way of being. And that's what an espiritista strives for.
So if we can rewind it back just a little bit to the spirits again, because in your book you speak a little bit about the spirits, but not too much into detail about like the different kinds of spirits. So, like, for example, when we look at like Cuban Espiritismo, you still see like orishas, you see these various like categories of spirits. What about in Puerto Rican Espiritismo? Like, do we work with like the Taino gods? Like, what spirits do we work with, or is it just the dead?
No, it's not just the dead. We work with a number of spirits that we call protecciones. Some people call guías or spiritual guides. Okay. And the spiritual guides can have been spirits of dead individuals who've elevated throughout their service and spiritual evolution to become spiritual guides. So they can be dead, but they can also not be dead, meaning they were never human at all. For example, some Espiritistas work with angels, right? Many angels were never in human form, they never died. And there's another group of spirits, such as encantos. Encantos are spirits that are very much connected to nature, who were never alive, right? So it's not just the dead. That's a common misconception about Espiritista, is that Espiritista just work with the dead. We work with all different classifications of spirits, right? We're like what you said with Cuban Espiritismo, like they have a connection with in their form of Espiritismo. Oftentimes their spirits connect with orishas or something other than from other religious traditions. However, for us, we work with saints, with the spirits of the saints, right? So we're not often using them as a face to cover an orisha or a lwa, right?
We're actually using them as they're intended. Well, yeah.
Well, yeah, right, exactly, right. So
We're Catholic.
yeah, we're working with them in a more Catholic fashion, right? So we're working with them as saints, but we work with spirits that are dead, of course. We work with the ancestors, we work with the dead, but we also work with spiritual guides as a major classification of spirits, pure spirits, spirits who actually don't have any name as well, right? Because they're so pure that they've lost all sense of ego about them. So they don't have a name. So we work with all the various classes and forms of spirits. And very much oftentimes for us, a session, or what's known as a sesión, but we also call it a misa, we also call it a velada, reunión, all these things serves as a forum for whatever spirits need to communicate.
Gotcha. So when you were talking earlier about when a negative spirit or like a not so good spirit kind of pops in, that there is a difference between various espiritismos about what they do with that spirit. Some will send them away, some will heal. In this particular case, in Puerto Rican espiritismo, we talk about healing the spirit and lifting the causa, right? So, but you go into like certain categories of this as well, like, whether it's just like a disruption in psychology, whether it's an attachment, whether it's this and that. Like your book goes into so much detail about these harmful energies and what happens. And another thing about your book that I'm sorry, I'm all over the place because I love this book so much, is you give amazing examples with real life stories and clients that you've had, family members that you worked with, your visits to Puerto Rico and what you've seen and witnessed. And they are just such amazing stories because they hit home, and you speak about, you know, um, the one that I related to the most, and again, I don't want to give your entire book away, but the one that I related to the most was the story of, I think it's Ampara. Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
Amparo. And I related that to that the most because you see it so much, even like you see it all the time. You see people who want to run before they can crawl. You see people who might have a little bit of the gift and think to themselves, okay, well, I have a little bit of psychic ability, and so now I'm going to open up a shop and I'm going to heal people and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, before they've really gotten that good foundation, which can cause a lot of problems. And you explain that in your book. You explain like how the foundation is so important. Can you go in a little bit about that? Like, can you talk a little bit about what is a good foundation? Like, where should people start? And if someone were to come to you and say, I have psychic ability, what should I do now? What kind of advice would you give them?
Okay. So, yeah. So basically, it's really important to have that good foundation. I always use the analogy of like basically Beyonce came out with a talent to sing, but had she not gone through training and development, she wouldn't be Beyonce. She wouldn't be able to really work that talent, and it wouldn't be as fine tuned as what it is currently. She wouldn't have gotten anywhere with just raw talent, right? And she may have gotten a little ahead, but she wouldn't be Beyonce, right? It's very important to have that foundation because when we're working in the spiritual world, right, for every little bit that you do see, there's thousands of times that you don't see.
Right.
And I've been doing this, like you said earlier on, since 1989, and I trained under Espiritista for about 20 years, almost 15 years, 17, somewhere around there. And so I've seen it time and time again where people like they might have just had their first psychic experience, and within a few months or even a few days, the next thing is like, oh yeah, I'm meant to go open a shop and do this and do that and do this and do that. And it gets like that. And part of it is because you need to get out of the world. The world has taught you to be ambitious. The world has taught you that everything is a rush, but you can't rush spirit things. Spiritual
Right.
things, they can't be rushed. And when you do, you often find it's you make a mess for yourself that just wasn't worth it, right? And so many people I have seen, like they start off good, they have all this, beauty, they have their natural gifts. And I'm gonna say something. Can I cuss on here?
Yes.
All right. By getting other people involved in their spiritual things, they fuck it up.
Yep.
They fuck their life up. They fuck their world up. They fuck their light up. And some of them become really even nasty individuals because they become so hurt by what people have done. A lot of times, a person who is an espiritista, or spiritual in any way, we want to help people, right? Oftentimes so much so that it comes to our own detriment, right? And if you're hurting yourself, you're not helping anyone. If you're hurting yourself, you're disrespecting yourself, which means you disrespect everyone else. Also, a lot of times people don't want to just say I don't know. It's a very much an ego thing, and it comes from an idea that someone's supposed to know everything. I have no problem telling you I don't know something. If I don't know, I just don't know. Maybe I'll know someday. Maybe I won't. It's okay not to know things. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of ambition that has been placed into people through the regular material world.
Right.
You got to run, run, run. Hurry up and get that diploma. Hurry up and get that thing. Hurry up and get,
Capitalism.
right?
Capitalism. Western
Exactly.
influences.
Exactly.
You have
And
to be producing something and coming, it's horrible. Money, money,
exactly.
money, money.
Exactly, and everything. Even people with, like, say, their art. It's like, well, how can I make money out of this? If I'm not making money out of it, it's not worth anything. That's not true, because the path of Espiritismo is not about what you're gaining in the outer world. It's about that you're gaining yourself, that you're gaining your God-given power to be the totality and live the totality how you're supposed to live and be whole. And if anything, if you gain anything else, those are side bonus points, right? A lot of times, many people I see get crushed by helping other people too soon, right?
Yeah.
Where they started helping people too soon and they either wore themselves ragged, they drained themselves out, or they actually took on those people's problems and now started to have those problems in their own life. There's no need to rush, and I understand the desire to rush. I understand the feeling of it. I understand the fire that comes with it, especially when it's something that has helped you,
For
right?
sure.
You feel like really like fiery to like pass it on.
Yeah.
Trust me, I totally understand that. I have been hit a few times about it, right? Because let me gonna say something is that everyone wants the old days and the old ways, but let me tell you, in the old days and the old ways, your mentor might just slap you in the face, okay? And I've gotten slapped in the face plenty of times. Now nowadays, you go to a mentor and
No
the mentor
channel.
slaps you in the slaps you in the face, una buena pescosa, as we say, right? Gives you a good whack on the face, you want to call the cops. So you don't really want the old ways, okay? Because the old mentor has no problem just hitting you over the head with something when you're acting stupid. And never would you get upset at the mentor. You'd be thankful to the mentor for like waking you the hell up, right? So for someone who's just starting, what I would say is books aren't everything. However, do your research. Read, learn, read. Do not get initiated in none of the spiritual paths. Do not right away.
Right.
If someone tells you you need an initiation right away, they're probably full of shit. There's very few situations that require that. There are situations, but usually you would already know that. Because you would know that. It would be clear to you when that's actually the case. Okay?
Very, yes.
It's going to be clear to you, and it's going to be clear to you what initiation, in what path you need to be initiated. If you're still wondering what your path is, okay, and you just decided a few weeks ago, like Santeria is your path, or Voodoo is your path, or that's your path, there's no need to get initiated tomorrow. Oftentimes when people come to me, okay, here in this, where I'm at in my temple, you can't just come in here, okay? We don't just initiate you because you ask. We don't really care what you ask for, okay? That's
not... You're going to get what you're going to get. Anything at all.
You're going to get what's meant for you.
Right.
And you're not, this is not McDonald's, baby, okay? I don't care that you have the money. I've had people offer me $50,000 to baptize them in 21 divisions. And I've been broke as a joke back in the day when that happened to me. And back in the day, even as then, I'm like, no, baby, you're not worth it.
You see, you get tested too. The people forget about that part. You get tested.
No one's worth it, okay? No. So if it's no, it's no. So anyway, so very often people will come to priests too and be like, yeah, like they want to make their first step initiation. They don't even have foundations. They don't even have anything. They don't even know. I'm going to tell you a little story where I knew someone. They had just went and got initiated in Haiti. They returned from Haiti. One day I'm visiting them at their house, right? I didn't know about all this stuff going on with them. By the time I met them, that had already happened. So I go to their house and they're like, you know, I just don't feel like I'm making any spiritual progress or whatever else. And I was like, well, of course not. Half of your sacred items are sitting on top of the fridge. The other half are on a windowsill. And why are they there? And he's like, yeah, I figured they look nice there. You know, it looked good to decorate them there. This is the type of thing that I'm talking about, where like you don't even have enough foundations to know what you're getting yourself into, right? So do a lot of research, do a lot of learning, read books that are available. Understand, however, that because you've read the books doesn't mean you know anything, okay? Because when you go to an espiritista or a practitioner who's been practicing, there's tons of stuff that's not in the books, okay? When I'm able to write a book, you know, the publisher gives me 200 pages. I can only cover so much, okay?
You don't get paid by the word no more.
You know, and we're not even allowed to surpass a certain number of words, okay? You're not allowed to, right? So, like, I only have so much space that I can write. People have asked me, actually, from this book, like, hey, I noticed this wasn't here, or that wasn't there, or here, this wasn't here. Yeah, I only have 200 pages, darling. Everything's not going to be in there. And nor could everything even be conveyed well in a book. So do get your research, do learn a lot, etc., and then actually start to look for a mentor. You can start to do some simple development exercises. In fact, in the back of this book, I give like how to get started and getting started with developing yourself, etc., etc.
Spiritual baths. You do a whole bunch of stuff. The book is amazing, you guys. I can't speak any more of it. Oh.
And one of the most important things I wrote it back there is about an initial 90-day practice, which people should start, right? And really, if most people did that, and saw the amount of work and commitment it took to actually develop, then ask yourself what's next for you, right? And I even mentioned it in that book, like in the book, like if you can't commit to that 90 days, then
why would you want to get initiated into anything? You know what
and
I
why
mean?
would
Like,
you want to get involved any further? Does that make sense? And I can understand, like, hey, you try to make the commitment, you get on the wagon, fall off the wagon, but at least you keep trying, you know? So that try to get a lot of learning in and then start to look for a mentor and take your time. Get to know get to know your mentor as much as you can. Learn from the mentor. Another thing I tell people is if the mentor says that they can't teach you anything whatsoever prior to you getting initiated, that's suspect.
that is
That's
so
questionable.
sus.
That's
Yeah.
so sus and so questionable. And I've met many people who were like, yeah, I was told like I wasn't allowed to learn anything really until after, and that after I would be taught. And of course, they were never taught. But
I've actually been told that, well, I've observed, sorry, I've observed that in some initiatory traditions, they actually require you to do Espiritismo and to do sesiones first before initiating into their thing. Now, but that's not across the board. That's like some people, right?
yeah, that's some traditions that do that. However, in my experience, from having been around all these things for the last 30 some years or whatever, is that a lot of times, there in the olden days, it was not uncommon that people would have to come and get trained and develop in Espiritismo for 2, 3, 4, 5 years before they went in through any initiations. These days, in places where I've seen that they require it, I even see where they try to rush people through all of that in 2 or 3 days and just move them into the initiation because that's where they're going to make their bread at. Okay, and et cetera, et cetera. So, unfortunately, a lot of times people will be like, yeah, I've had my misas done or this and this and that, but it didn't do anything. They're doing, in between those sesiones, you have to work on what's been given to you. Right? And you're not going to have a session today accomplish everything you need to do in the course of like a week before you have your second session. It used to be you have a session, then there might be a month or 2 months before you have the next one, right? Before you have the next major session. So then again, you're given, hey, this is what's for you to do, da, 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 da. And throughout that course of time, you're working with your mentor, right? You're having training or classes or however it is your mentor does it, and then getting you to working through everything, right? So there are some places, unfortunately, in the capitalism world, right? Everything is about how quickly can you get things done.
Yeah.
How fast. Everything is about moving fast, right? And Espiritismo is not a practice that you can move through fast. In fact, there is no practice spiritually that you can move through fast. You can think you're getting somewhere and then later find out you've really gotten very much little to nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah, the way it should be going like this.
Yeah,
but
it's a
instead people
slow
go like
process.
this. So, speaking of that, so you had mentioned in the book, and even in our little pre-interview too, that Espiritismo and the practice of Espiritismo is an open tradition. It wouldn't be considered a closed tradition. So there's no real initiation, although there are some schools that will do like special baptisms and special like things, but for the most part it's an open tradition. Now, being the people that we are, Puerto Ricans, like you said, adaptable. We are open. We kind of go with the flow. We keep things alive because we are flexible and adaptable. But is there ever like a moment where you get a little nervous at the idea of it being an open tradition and just anyone can kind of come in and play with these things, especially since the idea of getting a mentor, yes, it's you should and need to do that, but it's not a requirement. Like people can technically learn medium stuff like on their own. They won't get far, but they can. So like what's your take on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Is that I'm not really worried about it. Why? Because that's why we faded. We faded because we're so open that, in fact, without a mentor, it's going to be hard for you to get anywhere because you're going to basically go to a lot of dead ends. Okay. So, like you said, yes, you can develop a little bit. Yes, you might get a little bit of traction, but in the most part, you really, without a mentor, it's going to be hard for you to get really any far. A blind man doesn't know how to walk to to some unknown destination, to some place he's never seen. So that's one. Number two is an, another thing that I would say is that in a lot of it's already happening with a lot of practices that are considered closed practices, where people are kind of like, hey, I'm not going to go ahead and, get initiated, or I'm not going to go ahead and like follow
Oh, yeah.
apprenticeship or route, but I'm just going to take this from here, that from here, this from here, that from here, mix it all together, do my own thing. And if the priest or the priestesses of those traditions say anything, I'm going to say, like, you're wrong, and F you, and all this, and all that, and I want to do what I want, etc., etc. So, like, I already see that happening with practices like Santeria, etc., etc., right? For someone who's an Espiritista, in Mesa Blanca, there's almost like less for that person to gain. At least if they're pretending to be a santero, they're given a title and a this and a that and all these fancy honors, etc. Whereas in this, you're just, for us, it's like, yeah, so okay, that's nice, right? And because you're going to have to prove yourself again and again, and you're constantly going to be up for verification and proof. Your title, there's no title to carry you anywhere. Right?
So there's no hierarchy, there's no fancy jewelry, there's no it's a very humbling, it's a humbling tradition. It's you are who you are, and if anyone doubts that, you do the thing.
Exactly. So you can't bullshit around by saying, hey, I'm like high priest so and so, or high priestess so and so, or this or that, or I'm like the grand medium or the grand espiritista. That's not going to get you anywhere, right? So you're not going to get that title from it. And you can claim what you want to claim, but like I said, it's going to come out in the wash when people are actually asking you to do things for them and to actually progress them and all these things. It's going to come out because you don't have the work to back it up, right?
And now too, especially with like this new age, like 5D higher consciousness movement, this whole love and light movement, it's really terrifying because I see so many like budding psychic mediums and people who claim to be spiritists and espiritistas who are on this bandwagon of like, there's no such thing as bad spirits, there's no such thing as evil spirits, you don't need to fear nothing, all this stuff. And I'm sitting here going, bitch, I know that's a lie, I know that is a lie. But I mean, like, I understand not fearing, I understand that you should approach your spirituality, you should approach, the unknown with love and with openness just to be safe. But like, to just completely deny that things like that exist, I think that's kind of scary. And then be like, sure, it's free reign for all, like, what?
Well, to me, it just proves that you're not as psychic as you think you are.
Right.
Okay. Because if you were as psychic as you thought you were,
you would have seen some shit.
You would have already seen some shit. Someone who has seen some shit, okay, knows that some shit out there exists. Yes. And there is no one telling you nothing. When someone says like, oh, there's no evil spirits, etc., it tells me that you're a believer. There's a difference between someone who's a believer and someone who is a knower.
But see, that's where I think the Kardecian spiritist movement really has a hold, because again, it's no offense, but it's kind of a statement of privilege and racism. Because when they are talking about there's no such thing as evil spirits, if you see evil spirits, then you are lower vibrational. That means you are fearful. That means you're attracting these things, and it's you, but they don't really exist. It's a very like privileged, like racist, and it's coming from that like mindset, that Kardecian mindset. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but that's how I see it.
No, it is, but also the other thing is those same people who you see saying that are filled with anxiety. depression, anger, resentment, greed, and many of these other things, right?
Yeah.
And you can see it very simple. When someone turns around and says, actually, yeah, there's negative spirits and I've seen them, they'll come lashing at that person like a pack of wild animals.
Facts.
So if the anger is not in you, it can't come out of you. So if you weren't an angry bitch, okay, filled with negative energies, you wouldn't be angry at this person for saying, hey, I don't believe what you're saying here.
Right.
You would be more like, well, it is what it is. You can believe what you want, but I know that no evil exists. But again, that's like saying poverty doesn't exist, lying doesn't exist.
Just because I don't see it.
Hunger doesn't exist because I haven't seen it or haven't experienced it or want to turn a blind eye to it, right? You can pretend not to see all that you want to. Everything that you pretend not to see has more power over you than you have over it.
Facts. Facts. And like to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about earlier, when you were giving all of these examples of, you know, the different types of spirits and the different types of attachments and things that could potentially go wrong. You know, you and I just gave a few examples earlier in the live where you're like, this idea of maybe an emotional disturbance or this idea of maybe feeling ill or feeling sick when you have something not so pleasant around you. That's the least of it. Like, that's like the stuff that like you kind of hope happens if you encounter something not so great. Like, I remember when I was first starting out, my very first psychic ability, the thing that I was able to really sense the most was physical feeling. So like if someone had died of stomach cancer, I felt that in my stomach. If someone had a broken leg, I felt like my leg was broken. Like, it was very real for me in every essence of the word. That is bare minimum of what I could potentially have experienced had I not taken the time to train. Do you know what I mean? And like, people don't realize that these attachments are much more dangerous than people claim it to be. And people like you, espiritistas like you, spend time to lift those, to clean those, and it doesn't happen overnight, right? Like, it's not like they come to a session and you lift it and boom, they're well again. Like, it takes time.
No, it takes time. Sometimes in the olden days, especially, someone may be told, like, you're going to need 5 sessions. And at the end of 5 sessions, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk and see where you're at, see where the spirit is at, you know, see where that relationship between you and that spirit is at.
Because again, it's about healing the spirit, not just sending them away.
No,
it's about
because
lifting them.
Yeah, because it's about healing both the human spirit, the living person, and the other spirit, right? And if that healing really isn't complete, what's going to happen is the human's just going to attract another. You're going to end up in another cycle of doing the same thing. It's just going to return, right? And if that spirit isn't healed, it might just return, right? Because everyone needs what they need, including a spirit. And you, as we say, por la buena, por la mala. Either you're going to get it the easy way, the good way, or you're going to get it the bad way and the hard way. It doesn't matter. But when you need something, you won't get it.
That's right.
All right.
So, Papa, what are you going to be up to? Are you teaching any classes? Are you running any groups? Are you doing any events in the near future? Where can people reach you?
All right. So I'm at HectorSalva.com. I'm also at mysticalwork.com. And our email is help@mysticalwork.com. Our Facebook, our Instagram is Houngan Hector. Our TikTok is at Papa Hector Salva. Someone already took my name before I it. Okay, so at Papa Hector Salva, and we have YouTube. I'm always doing classes. I'm constantly training my people because that's a major part of what I do. So we're always running classes. I'm always training people. We always have classes coming up. We're constantly doing ceremonies. Next thing I have is a Mesa coming up at the end of this month, February. But we do Mesas quite often. We have adjusted to the times, and now people can even attend virtually. So yeah, so we have that going on. We have ceremonies going on here all the time. This place is just constantly busy, busy, busy with spiritual work.
Are your misas open to the public, or is it just for your temple?
Most of them are open to the public. We do some that are private. We also do some that are private for people who are in development. So, but many of them are public ceremonies. And I usually put that information out all over the social medias and everywhere else that we can. So we have all of that going on. And like I said, we're always taking people, have new apprentices starting, etc. A journey of apprenticeship is really about the individual, right? So that journey is about that individual. So we're always having new people come in, starting their apprenticeships here. So yeah, we have just like tons of spiritual activities constantly going on. We do like 60 plus hours of spiritual stuff throughout the week. Yeah. So
hey, you asked for it.
yeah, so we're constantly doing stuff. Yeah. And like I said, you can find me on all the social medias, on my website, Hector Salva, the book, Espiritismo, Puerto Rican Mediumship and Magic. It's available everywhere that books are sold, Amazon, Kindle, etc. I'm also working on the Spanish versions of both of those books that have been requested by plenty of people, all my Boricua, all my Dominicano, all my Puerto Ricans and my Dominicans asking for their versions of their books. So I'm currently working on that. We're just constantly doing stuff.
And let me ask you one last thing. Like, what was the purpose of this book? Like, why did you want to write this book?
There was a number of reasons that I wanted to write this book. One is that the practice of Puerto Rican Mesa Blanca Espiritismo is fading away. And it's been fading away for a long time. Since I first started on the internet in 2000, people have been asking me to write a book on Espiritismo. But the time comes when the time comes, and apparently the time is now. So,
maybe.
exactly. So it's been fading and fading. It's even hard for people to find people who practice Puerto Rican Espiritismo, even on the island.
Yeah.
Right. Even in Puerto Rico, because in many places they do practice a different form, such as Cuban Espiritismo or Venezuelan or some other form of Espiritismo or another tradition altogether. Yeah. So it is fading. It has been fading, but it's a beautiful spiritual path, a beautiful spiritual tradition that is filled with wisdom and filled with knowledge and filled with what people need in order to grow in the spiritual movement, in their spiritual paths. So that was one. The second thing is that Puerto Rican Espiritismo is one of the few traditions of the West that is also a tradition that is about the evolution of the human soul to lead them into unity with God and with their power with God. And it's one of the few traditions that is geared towards not just the magical ends of things, but also enlightenment. And enlightenment for me, just because there's when we speak, when two people speak, we often assume we mean the same thing when we use a word. Right? But very often that's where miscommunication occurs. So enlightenment in Espiritismo is about being free of suffering, right? Living a life of bliss and ecstasy. Living a life where you're actually filled with bliss and filled with ecstasy and enjoying all of it and becoming one. So Puerto Rican Espiritismo is one of the few traditions in the West that's actually geared towards that. And it's something that most people don't know. Right? Most people, like I said, this discrimination against our traditions is like they're all backwards and, savage and like, and that's not true.
Yeah. Would you consider, is Espiritismo a religion or is it like a philosophy?
None. It's a practice. Okay. Philosophy, okay, you can end in your mind forever. Philosophies can go on forever and never take you anywhere. Right? You can sit around and question and question and question. A philosophy means to me not knowing. It means a belief. right? And our tradition of Espiritismo is not about belief at all. It's about knowing, and there's a difference between knowing something and believing something, or even believing that you know something, right?
Yes.
So it's not that. It's not a religion. It's not a religion. However, the practitioners are probably the most religious you've ever seen, because there's a difference between being someone who's religious in a religion versus being religious. A
Mm,
person who is religious is naturally humble. A person who is religious naturally accepts others, loves others, brings about love and joy into the world, right? We don't divide, we don't separate, we don't create war, right? And when we do, there's a purpose. The true purpose behind it is out of love. So I don't consider any of those things. I consider it a practice, and what we teach people are mainly the practices that they need so that they can get there themselves.
I love it.
So that was my third reason was because most people know about, Cuban Espiritismo, which we touched upon. Puerto Rican Espiritismo, as explained in the book, as I just said, has been fading, and very few people know what is exactly Puerto Rican Espiritismo, right? And I want that to get across before basically it disappears. Lastly, I want to leave the book for people who need it, for people who are searching for such things, and also for all people like my children, etc., right? So that in many ways, part of the reason that Espiritismo faded was because of the persecution and discrimination we faced. Many of the elders felt embarrassed to pass it on,
Yeah.
or were trying to protect their children from that same discrimination so they wouldn't pass it on, right? Trying to get us opportunities so that they wouldn't pass it on, right? One story that I often tell is that, for example, when my grandmother came to the US, the campaign against Espiritismo was pretty strong. And so when she decided to come to the US, she decided she was going to leave that behind her, or so she thought. And she started working in factories like many Puerto Ricans did, say sewing.
My
And
grandma too.
yeah, right. So as a
Yeah.
seamstress in factories, and she lost a bunch of jobs, mainly due to other Puerto Rican women, right, telling on her, saying that she was a bruja and espiritista, etc. And the discrimination was so hard, right, that basically she would get fired, eventually landing her to what she was meant to be doing anyway, which was continuing to be what an espiritista, doing her work, and she thought she was going to leave that alone. So the discrimination against Puerto Rico has been really real.
Yeah.
And the campaign by multiple governments to destroy any sense of culture or roots there has been very real and detrimental for many Puerto Rican people.
Yeah.
Many Puerto Rican people are disconnected from their roots. Many of them don't know where to find their roots. And many of them, have gone through or have mainly grown up in groups of people or families who are encouraging, like many other places in the world, Americanization, right?
Yeah.
And there's something really important in knowing where one comes from and knowing one's roots in order to understand oneself. So, those are just a few of the reasons that I wrote the book. And I'm hoping that it can help many people to be able to understand our tradition, help spiritual workers or espiritista with their clients or with their godchildren, to help them understand what they're talking about, etc. Just make everyone's life easier.
Well, I have to say, just on behalf of, myself and anyone else who is part of my tribe who agrees with things that I say, thank you. Thank you. You know, yeah, I think you are maybe one of maybe two or three people who are trying to talk about this. And so I want to thank you for resurrecting something that was disappearing, and it was needed. It was desperately needed. So thank you. Thank you for that. You guys, please pick up this book. You will not regret it. I can't speak more highly of it. You will not regret it. Papa Hector, I hope to see you on my show again. I hope you continue writing more books. I hope to get closer to you in the future and have a deeper relationship with you as well, because, again, you're one of my favorite people and you're so wise. And I enjoy watching you on your lives, on YouTube, TikTok, wherever you are. I love watching your videos and getting those little droplets of wisdom. Don't ever stop. You're definitely one of the important ones that needs to stay around and be present on social media for all of us youngins out here.
You're most welcome. Oh, thank you so much.
All right, you guys. Well, that was Papa Hector. We talked about Espiritismo. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you guys who showed up tonight for the live. We have Alex, Steven, Mambo Sandy, Gabrielle, Medina, Rob, Mars, Sonia, TJ, all these names, Reina. Wow, you have a huge fan base, bro. I can't even get through all these names. Cryptic. You guys, thank you so, so, so much for coming. And for those who will be watching this show on replay, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share. Because after all, this is how we grow. Have a great night, guys.